Hello everyone, and welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is, I Won't Whistle You Back Home. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like, and if you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe and become a resident of Hill Street, and let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. Max, stop that please, I mumbled, trying to hide my mix of annoyance and fright. I really didn't want to make a fuss out of this, but he had to stop doing that. I was already getting goosebumps and couldn't hide it anymore. There's no one around here, not even crickets. I'm just whistling to make the time go by faster. He said that and resumed his joyful whistle, but my calm ran out. Shut it, now! I yelled, louder than I thought my already shallowed breath would allow me. The echo, making me feel remorseful, but at the same time, glad there was no whistling anymore. Not realizing I had also grabbed his shoulder. You really didn't have to say it like that, you know? I was just trying to lighten up the mood. I'll not do it again. But what's wrong with you? Your hand is ice cold. He looked at me awkwardly. It reminds me of how much I hate football, and I can't whistle myself. I lied, but Max believed me and didn't question it further since he knew football was something not quite up my alley. About the cold hands part, I couldn't really give him any explanation for it. It was a July evening. It had barely gotten dark, and we were walking back home from our evening run through the park. I needed something to clear my head, but I had also needed someone to bring along first, due to my paranoid nature. So here we were. The thing is, I knew how to whistle. The problem though, I was afraid to, and I was never going to do it again or risk being around someone who does. My grandfather always told me whistling brought bad luck if you did it outside the house, and even worse, things could happen if you whistled while you were outside, or outside and alone, like we were. Obviously I was young and never heard of that advice, and dismissed it as something that elders would say so we would stop making so much noise. Needless to say, years later, looking through the old photographs in the countryside house we used to own, I came across one depicting him and my grandmother, whom I've never met or knew. I always assumed they either divorced or she had died before I was born, since my mother never mentioned someone else apart from her mother. They looked content. Happy would be too much. Nothing out of the ordinary, apart from the fact that the woman had her lips as if she was whistling while the photo was taken. It didn't strike me as weird at all, with all the duck poses my generation does nowadays. The next photograph was one taken around 10 years later. My grandfather was alone in the picture. He seemed serious, trying to make a smile for the camera, but his eyes were sad. But the thing that made me stop and slightly choke was when my hands were getting colder as I held on to the photograph. As I made the connection between what his saying was and the woman's lips with the message handwritten on the back of the yellowed photo. I wish I could bring you back, but it has to stay this way. I won't whistle you back home. That was the point where I realized something wasn't quite right, and I was split between actually believing it or dismissing it yet again as old man grief. The decision was never made, since being a teenager was a full-time job, and I had no time to spare to actually think and consider things. Alas, my blissful ignorance was short-lived. Before having Max as a running partner, I used to take my dog out for walks every single evening. That was my one and only form of exercise. It all came to an end one cold, fierce winter night. No snow, just pure cold, and a feeling of dread of going out and getting actual cold feet. I knew I had to walk the dog, both out of habit and for his daily walk and needs. He didn't seem all that enthused though, more like restless and unnerved, as if he really would have rather stayed home. I live in a flat, so my choice was to either show him how nice it is outside, or to be awoken at night by him and his need to actually go out. The daylight was short. By the time I had realized it was getting late, I had to rush back home so I wouldn't miss dinner. On my way back home, the dog kept barking around the streets as if looking for something, annoying me further on since no other dogs were outside and he doesn't bark at people. His focus seemed to be a lady with a wide-brimmed snow hat, walking and gently whistling while looking upwards. Unconsciously, I picked up the whistle and started trying to get my dog's attention. That got it right, and I got in the house, closing the gate on my way in. As I crouched down to unlace my shoes, the dog ran down into the yard and started barking again, but I didn't mind it, since I was already home, and I knew that the whistling lady had been his attention, but she was 3 streets behind, as well as walking in the opposite direction. The barking stopped, so I tried whistling him back home, as I had already gotten my shoes off. But after a couple of minutes, he was still outside, yet no barking either. Night was already in full bloom, but I could still see that the gate was still closed after I came in, so I knew he must have been somewhere in the yard. What stopped my whistling and made me freeze in place was the hat lady that was across the street under a street lamp, with my dog's red leash in one hand, her hat in the other, the whistling lips, and what's worse, the same eyes and face as in my grandfather's old photograph, not a day older or a wrinkle added. She waved at me with the hand that held the leash, put her hat back on with the other hand, and resumed her walk away from the gate. As she turned around the corner, the whistle was still audible, first due to the echo on the street, then due to the echo of my thoughts, keeping me awake at night. I told my parents that the leash had broken, hence why I was missing that too, and the dog had run away. This lie was also believed. We put up some missing posters, but I knew he wasn't going to be back, even if I whistled. This history raced through my mind all over again when Max pointed out my distress caused by his whistling, but I couldn't help it. It was a loose thread in my life in the last few months. My house was the first one up the road. We would split there, and he would walk on 5 more streets to his. "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you feel nervous or something," he said as my house came into view. "I overreacted. I'll see you tomorrow. Everything's all right." I tried to get things back to normal between us, since we haven't talked since I lost my temper, and shouted at him to cease the whistling. As I turned around to close the door, I waved at him thinking I indeed overreacted, and he waved back while shouting, "I did say I'm sorry, but now I can do this all the way back home since you won't hear it. See you tomorrow." As he said that, he started whistling, and I closed the door, slightly angry he'd picked on me with that. But my rapid breathing was a product rather of inexplainable fear than of anger. The following day at school, Max skipped the first class. It seemed he was going to skip the second as well as the next ones. So the teacher looked at me and said, "Oh well." He whistled. "Judging by your tired face, I'm guessing you and your desk mate had some late night fun last night." I smiled, nodded, and the teacher went on with the other absentees. After all, I couldn't do more than nod. I was frozen, not only by the fact by hearing a whistle once again in such a scenario, But by the notion that my friend decided to skip school without saying anything apart from the joke whistle he did that previous night. The worst part? It wasn't the only day he skipped. Questions are popping up, and my answers are still missing.